Hey guys, welcome back to a new Q&A here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I'm Alex here with this Bolt breakdown episode. So I put out questions to our YouTube community tab and our Twitter since weren't doing a live Q&A last week. So let's chop it up and see what you guys sent in as the questions. I'm in a little bit of a exotic location outside here in Florida. So let's talk about these questions. Let me just share my screen. And before we get started, I do want to say, go check out Manscaped, obviously, 20% off your first purchase. You know the deal, but I had to give them a plug. So yeah, let's start with the YouTube community tab questions. So we have Renee Vandervelden. This question didn't quite age well because, as we know now, Julio Jones has been traded to the Titans, but I do think this is an interesting question to ask if they do pick up another receiver or just future Chargers stuff. If the Chargers were to trade for Julio Jones, do you see the Chargers re-signing Mike Williams and having Williams and Jones on the outside and move Allen into the slot? So I think this is an interesting thing for the potential of re-signing Mike Williams now. Obviously, post no Julio trade, that is somewhat likelier. And now, you do kind of focus in on Josh Palmer. I do think they have a vision for him to be an outside receiver in the future, but I sort of think it would be in replacing Mike Williams as opposed to re-signing him. But we obviously have to see how Josh Palmer plays this year and if he's, sort of good enough to take that role yet. So that's going to be an important thing. But in terms of moving Allen to the slot, I think that is an interesting idea. As he gets older, that's something I think that the Chargers will maybe look into. Not this year and probably not next year, but, he is on a 4-year deal. So as he's, 32, 31, that might be a bit of a factor in terms of determining where he plays on the field, especially if you are getting really good production out of Josh Palmer and say something happens, and we'll get to this name later, Davante Adams, if they were to sign another outside wide receiver, that would certainly lend itself to the idea of maybe Allen moving to the slot. But we'll see. Chargers fan 21 asks, who will be second on the team in sacks behind Bosa? I think this is pretty easy. I would say, barring injuries, obviously he had COVID last year, which was a bummer. It has to be Uchenna Nwosu. I don't see any reason it wouldn't be him. Maybe it's somebody on the interior like Linval Joseph. Jerry Tillery is a possibility if, all the other defenders are getting matched up well, and he has a couple games like the Kansas City game from last year that people remember, where he was just getting quarterback hit after quarterback hit and terrorizing Mahomes that game. But I think for that to happen, he really has to just focus in and sort of, everyone else on the defense has to be preoccupied and they let Jerry Tillery slide through. That could happen, but I do think it'll ultimately be Uchenna Nwosu that is going to be second on the team in sacks. I would be pretty surprised if it wasn't at this point. JIC asks, what would you call a successful season for the Chargers this upcoming season? I've thought about this a lot, and I think it's really predicated on 3 or 4 things. One is they're playing meaningful football in December, January. Obviously, last year they did rattle off that 4-game win streak, but it was kind of a meaningless win streak because they did crater and were 3-9 out of the playoffs at 3-10. They were out of the playoffs around 4-9 the next week. So they weren't playing any meaningful football in December, January. I think if you are doing that, that is certainly a step up from last year. And I sort of thought about it in 3 ways in terms of the 3 things I want to see this year. Obviously, you want to get more than 7 wins. I think if you get between, say, 7 and 10, that can be considered successful in a way. The most important thing for me, though, is no regression from Justin Herbert. Regardless of what the Chargers' record is, I think it's important that he's developing and is getting better as opposed to having a bit of a sophomore slump. And so that's going to be really important to watch. The most important thing this year for the next 10 years of the franchise, in my opinion. Also learning how to close games. The Chargers are still kind of a young team, and last year we obviously saw that with Anthony Lynn and all the blown leads. I think that takes its toll on a team just mentally. It's kind of really stressful to just go into every game being like, hey, we're up 14. We hope that thing that happens all the time doesn't happen again. So I think that that's important just for a young team that is looking to eventually become a Super Bowl type contender. I think it's important for them to learn how to win now, and particularly finishing out close games. And really, the last thing is just Brandon Staley proving he's the guy a little bit. Obviously, Anthony Lynn had a very good finish to his first year and ended up not being the guy. But I think if you can close games and kind of keep the team where it needs to be, that is going to be an important factor just going forward. So, like Steven has said, that 2021 for the Chargers is sort of a ramp up to the future Super Bowl contending years. So I don't expect the Chargers to be this juggernaut playoff team this year. But I think if you have some signs of positivity going forward, that's really what this team needs, especially after, I would say, the October-November period last season, obviously. Also from Chargers Fan 21, he asks, everybody talks about a Julio trade. How about a Danielle Hunter trade? So Danielle Hunter is not showing up to OTAs with the Vikings, and it's something about his contract, but he's not in a great position there because he does still have like $11-12 million left on 2 years of that deal, I think. I don't think Danielle Hunter will ultimately get traded. I think he'll ultimately show up to training camp. I don't expect him to get moved. I would be intrigued, though, if he really were to move, if they get to a position where they would trade him. That's a situation where I would consider giving up maybe a 4th, 5th round pick. I don't think that would be crazy. The only thing that concerns me about Danielle Hunter is he is coming off of neck surgery last year. If it wasn't for that factor, I may be willing to give up more draft capital, but it's a bit of a tough situation. And like I said, I don't ultimately think Danielle Hunter will be traded. I just think that's, that would be really tough for the Vikings letting him go because they don't really have much pass rush other than him. I mean, they did last year, they got Yannick Ngakoue, and that experiment failed, and then they just shipped him to Baltimore. Now he's with the Raiders. So, I think you just have to figure out who that pass rusher is going to be in Minnesota, and Danielle Hunter is a part of that. He's a very good player, but I probably wouldn't trade for him coming off of the neck surgery that he did last year. Let's go to the Twitter questions. Cole MCM23 asks, what's your number one concern for this season? And so I think my number one concern this year is, I did mention Justin Herbert regression. That I think not a very real concern. I don't think that's something that's going to happen, but it's something that's possible. The other thing I would say is injuries, and particularly when you're talking about the health of Derwin James. I think that's a huge component in terms of what could go wrong for this team, because we've seen how this defense looks when Derwin is not on the field. And so that's going to be, I think, a huge thing going forward. Just, the team stays healthy is really the biggest concern, because I think you do have Derwin James and obviously Joey Bosa, who had a lot of concussions last year. There's a lot of pieces that are supposed to be franchise pieces that I don't think can afford to get hurt, especially with Derwin James. I know they did pick up the 5th-year option, but if Derwin James were to suffer a knee injury again, that would put the Chargers in a tough spot long term. I don't think anything else really would from an injury standpoint, but the defense was just so beat up last year by like week 8. And I really hope that doesn't happen again, because I think we're in for another October-November stretch where, there's a bunch of games that they should win that they don't win because the defense just doesn't have it at the end of games. Edward Mises says, well, this is another Julio question. Julio Jones in a trade this year, or try to sign Davante Adams in free agency next offseason? So I will bring up the Davante Adams part of this because after Julio was traded, people did start to bring up Davante Adams potentially as an option next year. And the only thing that I think about that is I don't know if it's super obvious that he's going to be available. A lot of people bring up Aaron Rodgers' frustration with the franchise, and I think that will be a factor in Davante Adams' decision, but it's not going to be the whole thing, right? I mean, Brett Favre got traded to the Jets, and then Donald Driver signed a 2-year extension going into the Rodgers era. Every player is just in a different position with these organizations, right? There's sort of really 40, 45 unique relationships and positions to the organization. And while Aaron might have his problems with the organization, we haven't really heard anything on the Davante Adams side of, oh man, he wants out too, right? Now, obviously, again, that's pending this whole Aaron Rodgers thing and whether the Packers can figure that out. But don't discount the fact that they could trade Aaron Rodgers and still re-sign Davante Adams, just because their relationship might be better. And Davante Adams is really young, and whether you're going to a rebuilding quarterback, kind of like Jordan Love, rookie that they're trying to develop, or if you're going to Aaron Rodgers and obviously contending for a Super Bowl, the money might be there for Davante Adams either way. And I sort of still think that the Packers will get a deal done with him. But if he is in free agency next year, obviously you'd have to be stupid not to at least be interested in the concept of acquiring Davante Adams. Sorry, it's getting a little blustery. But yeah, so that's sort of my thought on that. I sort of thought that Julio was the opportunity to go for it now, not necessarily go for a Super Bowl, but to go get a guy that's going to be part of these next 2-3 years of this Justin Herbert rookie contract. Obviously, they could do the same thing with Davante Adams next year, but I just don't think it's as guaranteed that he hits free agency or wants out after Rodgers is out, as everyone seems to make it out to be. What Joaquin asks, Jerry Tillery and Nasir Adderley stat predictions. This is a really tough one, just because Jerry Tillery was so hot at the beginning of last year, like on fire those first 3-4 weeks, and then just tailed off and then was bad after about week 8, week 9 in the season. So I would say for Jerry Tillery, a good year for him would be like 5 sacks and maybe like, I think if he could apply 12, 13 quarterback hits, I think that would be a very good year for him. That's sort of my expectation with how they retooled the offensive line and how they're going to get Joey Bosa and some of those guys into matchup situations. So I think that would be a good year for him. I don't expect a ton of tackles for loss just because I don't think he's going to be great in the run game yet. Nasir Adderley is very interesting just because I don't know what, and he's going to be playing deep, which will be better for him, but I don't really know how many like interceptions or tip ball situations he'll have. In terms of tackles, I think he, if he gets like 30 or 40, that would be good. He just kind of needs to get those tackles and not rack up as many missed tackles as he did last year. That would be big. But I think as long as he does that, he'll be okay. Just to me, making a prediction on interceptions and that kind of stuff, it's kind of hard because we don't really know how many opportunities he'll have for pass breakups and stuff like that over the course of a whole season. Jeff Friday on Twitter asks, if healthy all season, does Derwin James win comeback player of the year like Keenan, Rivers, and Breeze before him? So the Chargers actually have this weird legacy of winning comeback player of the year a lot. Obviously, Keenan won it when he came back from his ACL injury. Rivers from playing bad, which kind of stunk in 2012, but got really good and really hot in 2013, which is when he won the award. So Derwin James is a possibility, right? I mean, he did obviously bang up his knee last year, didn't play, hasn't played a large chunk of the last 2 years. So it stands to say that, hey, if he comes back and he, looks like the Derwin James of 2018, he could be a contender for this award. But that being said, I do think there are a lot of big media names that will take a lot of attention away from Derwin James. You have, I think, 3 or 4 quarterbacks who can really contend for the award. Dak Prescott, obviously the favorite at plus 175, just because he was playing on that MVP pace, and then sort of obviously got injured, and that was the end of his season. But if he plays like he did the first 5-6 weeks of 2020, like, I think he's kind of a shoo-in for the award at that point, just considering how many times the Cowboys are going to be on national TV, how much attention they get. Like, I sort of feel like the voters want to give it to Dak Prescott. So if he stays healthy and looks okay, I tend to think he'll get the award. I think that's why he's kind of a decisive favorite over the field, as you see here to some extent. Nick Bosa, that might be the best defensive bet, just because he's going to rack up the sacks and all of that. But then you have 3 more quarterbacks with odds higher than Derwin James. You have Sam Darnold, Carson Wentz, and Joe Burrow, obviously tearing his ACL last year. Von Miller is back as another defensive player. So I think Derwin James is one of the best defensive player bets, along with Nick Bosa, along with Von Miller, just because he will be all over the field. And I do think that will give him some numbers. Maybe, Steven did stat predictions for Derwin James, I think, and he said something, maybe 1.5 sacks. I think that would be big for him. If he gets, obviously, 4 or 5 interceptions, that would be pretty huge. But it's just hard as a safety to rack up the numbers and stats that you need to win an award like Comeback Player of the Year. And so that for that reason, I wouldn't say Derwin James is out. Derwin James could always win the award and have a very surprising season. I would not count him out of it, but I would say it's going to be a little bit difficult for Derwin to win the award, at least in comparison to what people think. Just the amount of quarterbacks here, the amount of offensive, high skill players like Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Joe Mixon, Odell Beckham Jr. is, as you can see, almost tied with Derwin James for, odds here. And I was thinking about this the other day. This was written about a month ago, but Tim Tebow is plus 10,000. And that's just crazy. If he makes the roster and plays all 16 games, yeah, I think there's voters that'll give him attention because the media cannot get off Tim Tebow for whatever reason. He drives the content machine. So unfortunately, at plus 2,500 or plus 2,000, I would buy Derwin James odds and put $5 or $10 down on that. But I think there's too many defensive players, high-skilled offensive quarterbacks, and also, your skill position players. It's just a really competitive award this year, especially with Dak Prescott, potentially playing all 17 games. I think that might just kind of be the end of the award right there, in terms of ball game. All right, and last question comes from Marco Suriser. He says, do you think having Joe Lombardi as a new OC would benefit Justin Herbert? I really think having any OC that's not Shane Steichen will benefit Justin Herbert. And that's not to, pile on Shane, but I don't think he was ready for an offensive coordinator role last year. And Joe Lombardi is someone who's been around the NFL for a long time, obviously with the Saints, was offensive coordinator with the Lions, and that's the stint that makes people nervous. But it was also the Lions. And I think, after Calvin Johnson got to a certain point, and they lost him, like, I just think that was a tough situation to really recover from. But yeah, I think having Joe Lombardi as a new OC will help Justin Herbert. But I also think it'll be very different than, because a lot of people just compare it, it's going to be like the Saints offense and Drew Brees. But I think it's going to be a little bit different because Drew Brees and the Saints in the last couple of years have all been about really like quick, efficient passing, right? I don't know if that's what the Chargers are going to be. Like they're just going to be throwing, 7, 8 yards at a time. I do think they're going to give Justin Herbert the opportunity to take shots because his arm is big, and it's much bigger than what Drew Brees was, in the last couple of years. Obviously, Joe Lombardi wasn't the OC with the Saints, but if we're talking about him bringing those offensive influences over, I think that's what we're kind of talking about with Justin Herbert. So I think it'll benefit him. They really just need someone to not, we do talk about Anthony Lynn's run the ball philosophy a lot, and how that kind of hurt the team last year in a couple key instances like the Miami game. But I think having someone who's just really a steady hand kind of play caller, and someone who doesn't try to overthink things, I think that's going to be a good fit. I do feel like Shane Steichen and Anthony Lynn were trying to overcomplicate the offense a little bit last year, where there was like a third and one that I remember in the Bills game, and they tried like a jet sweep to Joshua Kelly, right? Like there were just some really weird moments, and in that same Bills game, people remember them running on the goal line when the clock was running. They didn't have any timeouts, so that was really frustrating. But yeah, I think having Lombardi and this new coaching staff will benefit Justin Herbert. Going into the second year will benefit Justin Herbert. I don't think there's a particular thing to worry about with Joe Lombardi. And in terms of sophomore regression, I think that's a very low risk possibility at the end of the day. But yeah, thanks for your guys' questions. I'm going to be putting this up on YouTube shortly. And yeah, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys next time.